The Twits. Written by Roald Dahl, narrated by Steffi Medrano and David Aiken.
Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted,
"There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground."
Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night, when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair.
"Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair,"
he cried.
"And you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air."
Mrs. Twit went white with fear.
"You've got the shrinks!"
cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol.
"You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen."
Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all.
"I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said.
"What?"
gasped Mrs. Twit.
"What happens?"
"Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes."
"I can't bear it!"
cried Mrs. Twit.
"It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world."
"How long have I got?"
cried Mrs. Twit.
"How long before I finish up with a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?"
Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face.
"At the rate you're going,"
he said, shaking his head sadly,
"I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days.
"But isn't there anything we can do?"
cried Mrs. Twit.
"There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit.
"Tell me!"
she cried.
"Oh, tell me quickly!"
"We'll have to hurry,"
said Mr. Twit.
"I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say,"
cried Mrs. Twit.
"You won't last long if you don't,"
said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin.
"What is it I must do?"
cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks.
"You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit.